Our scripture reading this morning is from Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 56. Now, when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been healed instantly. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he told them not to tell anyone what had happened. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning. My name is Sam. I'm one of the pastors here at Redeemer, and especially for those of you who might be new or visiting with us today, I want to say welcome. We're thankful that you have chosen to spend this time with us today, and we would love to have the chance to get to know you and your story. About a month ago, I read a book by the author Daniel Nayeri, and it essentially told the story of his own experience as a refugee whose family moved from Iran to Edmond, Oklahoma, around the time he was in middle school. He was still fairly young. And one of the things that really stood out to me is the way he described their experience at an immigration office with the United States Embassy. At the time, they were living in India. They were trying to find a place to seek asylum. They had kind of come that way through all these roundabout means, and they're there and they need help and they need to find a place to land. And the way he describes this embassy, they would go into this waiting room that was absolutely packed. All these different people seeking safety and asylum, people who were absolutely desperate, people who really needed help. And you would wait in this room almost the entire day to get to that front desk. But by the time they would get to the desk, they would run into all these different communication issues. Very rarely did the person working there speak their language, and there often wasn't a translator to kind of help smooth things along. And 9 times out of 10, as they would watch these families come through, someone would run into some kind of issue. There was a form that they needed that hadn't been filled out yet. Most of the time it was a form that they didn't even know about. And they had to then leave and come back and do the whole thing again. It was this place that sort of felt cold, where no one really had time to help. And the reason why I share this, the reason I bring this up is because I think for a lot of us, this idea, like, nobody has time. Like this experience of being in a place where it's like everybody's rushing, nobody has time to help. I think a lot of us sometimes bring that same kind of fear to Jesus. We think, does Jesus have time? Does Jesus have time for me? Of all of the needs and people who clearly need his help, does Jesus have time for me and for my needs? I think that's at least part of what's behind both of these interactions we read about in Luke chapter 8. There's this woman who is suffering. There's this father who's afraid, and they both come to Jesus wondering, do you have time to help me? Does Jesus have time? Does Jesus have time for me? Of all the people who clearly need his help, does Jesus have time to stop and help me? And so as we look at what we see here, as we sort of sit with this question, the first thing I want to look at is the story of this woman. This woman who comes to Jesus while he's already in the middle of something. Remember, Jesus is on his way to help this leader from the synagogue. A man named Jairus just came to him and says, my daughter's really sick. We really need your help. And while Jesus is on his way, Jesus goes with Jairus to heal her. He's stopped by this woman in a really unexpected way. And the thing that really hits me as we see this interaction is the way this woman sort of assumes that Jesus doesn't have time to help her. She knows that he's busy. She knows he's clearly in the middle of something. But I don't think her assumption is simply based on time constraints. I think what's behind this is she assumes he doesn't have time for her. If you look at verse 43, it says that she's had this unexplained bleeding for 12 years at this point. She's been suffering with this condition for over a decade of her life. She's tried all these different remedies. None of them have worked. And some of the early texts even note that she has now become poor because she has literally spent everything she has trying to find a remedy in search of some sort of healing. She's paid all these doctors, and they haven't been able to help her. But it's important for us to see this isn't just a matter of health. According to Jewish law, this kind of bleeding would render this woman ritually unclean, which means she had to keep to herself. She had to largely remain isolated because everyone who came in contact with her while she's in the middle of suffering this kind of bleeding would also be made unclean. So she's been cut off from her family. She's been cut off from her friends. She's been cut off from being able to worship at the temple, which means it's not just that she suffered physically. There's also this shame and isolation, and this has been her reality for almost a decade and a half. So when she comes to this crowd, when she tries to make her way to Jesus, she tries to do it in a way where nobody can see her. She wants to fly under the radar. She doesn't want Jesus to see her. She doesn't want anyone else to see her because she's not supposed to be there. She takes a massive, massive risk by coming into this crowd, but she does it because she's living in utter desperation. And so what does she do? Verse 44 says she comes to this crowd. She sort of sneaks through the people. She makes her way to Jesus because she believes that he can help her. And without saying anything, she wants to avoid drawing attention. She touches his robe and is instantly healed. Can you imagine that experience? You've been suffering and ostracized for over a decade, and within a second of touching Jesus, it all goes away. Your suffering is over. You're finally made well. It's like the healing power of God is somehow radiating out of Jesus. Because without him even knowing, without him even choosing this himself, he makes this woman better. He brings her back to health. And there are two things in particular I want us to see in this interaction. The first is the significance of this woman's faith as we consider everything that's happening here. I think her faith, her trust, her belief is really significant. And what do I mean by that? Well, lots of different people bump into Jesus. It says the crowds are pressing into him, but not everyone is healed. Surely this woman isn't the only one here in pain. Surely she's not the only one in this crowd in a place of suffering. Why does she receive healing that doesn't also come to others? And I think a big part of the difference is the reality of her faith, the fact that she comes to Jesus with genuine trust that he can help her. Now, I want to be clear. Does faith mean that, if we believe strongly enough, God gives us everything we want, that God gives us everything that we need, that he just kind of flips a switch and all of that gets better? Not at all. Even Jesus knows what it's like to ask and hear God tell him no. But faith is the channel through which God's goodness always comes to us. It connects and taps us into God's real and saving power. This is exactly why Jesus says what he says in verse 48. He says, "Your faith has healed you. Go now in my peace." Jesus is the one who heals this woman's body, but her faith is the channel through which that healing happens. This woman comes to Jesus and believes that he can help her. And he does. He heals her. He restores her back to health. But the second thing I want to highlight is the way that Jesus responds. How does he respond when this woman comes and does this? Remember, Jesus is in the middle of something. He's already going to help Jairus. Does Jesus seem frustrated by the way this woman comes and slows him down? Not at all. He doesn't seem annoyed. He doesn't act like she's a bother. No, the way that he responds is to actually stop and give her more time. He slows down. He engages her. He actually meets her where she is. I think a lot of us are sometimes hesitant to bring our needs to Jesus because we look around and think he has more urgent things to do. Maybe you're in a place where the thing that burdens you most feels small and trivial compared to some of the people around you. Or maybe you're in a place where your needs feel chronic. There's something that feel unchangeable, and it's like, well, man, there are much bigger emergencies that need much more urgent help. Like, why would I bother to bring this need to Jesus? But in the same way that Jesus is willing to make time for this woman, he is willing to make time for you and for me. We aren't an interruption. Jesus wants us to come and bother him. His heart goes out to you and to me in the same way it does for this woman in this crowd. But I want to turn now at this point to consider this father story, because I think this whole experience probably feels really different for Jairus. Remember, Jairus first came to Jesus in verse 41 in a very similar place of need and desperation. He says, "My daughter's really sick. We're worried that she's dying." It says he falls at Jesus' feet and starts pleading for his help. And for someone like Jairus, a man of his stature and position, he helps run the local synagogue. He is clearly a leader, a respected person in this community. He's likely the kind of person who rarely has to ask for help. For him to come to Jesus and literally fall down at his feet is a tremendous act of humility. He says, "I'm completely at your mercy. I have no hope apart from you if you don't show up and do something." And I imagine he felt a pretty major sigh of relief when Jesus says yes. When he says, "I want to come and help you." And then the two of them start to walk. They start making their way to Jairus' house. And it's precisely at this moment that this woman comes and stops them. Now, if I were Jairus, I'd be like looking at my watch the whole time. It's like, Jesus, we don't have time for this. Remember, my daughter's really sick. We don't have time to stop. We have to keep moving. And as Jesus slows down while he's talking to this woman, verse 49 says, someone comes from Jairus' house and says, there's no point bothering Jesus anymore. We ran out of time. Your daughter is already dead. The thing he's most afraid of, it actually comes true. And I know many of us in this room know exactly what that feels like. That strange combination of horror and numbness, the way right there in that moment your stomach turns to lead. And again, I think if I were Jairus, I would certainly feel grief, but if I'm honest, I think even more than that, I'd be feeling a pretty good amount of anger. Jesus, you said that you had time. Jesus, you said that you would help me, but then you got distracted and you didn't follow through. If you wouldn't have stopped, this wouldn't have happened. You could have healed my daughter, but you didn't. And now she's died. We're witnessing what is likely the worst moment of this man's life. And it's not just the grief over losing his child. It's the fact he comes to Jesus, and Jesus totally lets him down. I trusted you. I believed you. I thought that you could help me, but you ran out of time. You didn't come when I needed you. And what Jesus says next, it almost seems cruel. He says, don't be afraid. Just believe and she'll be healed. He says, don't be afraid. Just believe and she'll be healed. He says, I know that it seems like we have run out of time, but I need you to trust me. I can bring healing even here. It's the kind of thing that would be cruel, spoken by anyone other than Jesus, but Jesus actually has the power to bring his daughter back to life. And so they go to the house. This is exactly what Jesus does. Jesus takes her by the hand and invites her to get back up. It's a shocking kind of mercy. This is unexpected grace. As destructive as death is, Jesus is even more powerful. And even at a moment where it seems like time has all run out, Jesus shows up and shows them he's not limited in that way. With the woman, we see Jesus is willing to slow down and make time. But here we see time is no match for him at all. It's not something that binds him in the way that it binds us. When time runs out for us, it hasn't run out for Jesus. He's still able to surprise us with his goodness and his grace. At least that's what he does here for this family, which leads me to the last thing I want us to consider this morning, and that's, if this is what we see here, if this is who Jesus is, what does this say to you and to me? Does Jesus have time? Does Jesus have time for me? Of all the needs and people who clearly need his help, does Jesus have time to meet us where we are? And as we think about what we see in both of these interactions, what we see of Jesus' heart, what this says about who he is, there are really two, I think, practical takeaways I want all of us to see this morning. And the first is this: we have to show up. Again, Jesus wants us to come and bother him. Don't start with the assumption that Jesus doesn't have time for you, because if that's where we start, we'll always keep him at a distance. We will never give him a chance to actually meet us where we need him to. I think one of the things this woman's story wants to tell us is that Jesus welcomes us to come even in fear and in timidity. Maybe you're in a place where you don't know if you can trust him. Or maybe you're in a place where he's mostly let you down. Prayer always contains at least some level of risk, because to name our needs specifically to God opens us up to the possibility of disappointment. But if that's where we are, if that's what we're afraid of, even that is worth naming in the presence of Jesus. If we aren't able to pray from a place of deep, abiding faith, that's okay. Pray your fears, pray your anger, pray your doubts, your disappointment. Keep showing up to Jesus in whatever way you can, and invite him to come and enter that space with you. There's a writer named Ronald Rolheiser who says there is no bad way to pray, and there is no one starting point for prayer. All the great spiritual masters offer only one non-negotiable rule. You have to show up, and you have to show up regularly. I think the first practical takeaway is we have to show up, to start with the assumption that Jesus wants us to engage him. But the second is this: leave room to be surprised. Leave room to be surprised, even in the places where it seems like God can't work. Even in the places it seems like nothing can be done. If the story of this father tells us anything this morning, it's that Jesus has the power to surprise us with his grace, to show up in ways we can't anticipate or predict. What do I mean by that? Well, is there a person or a relationship or a situation in your life that you've simply written off, where it's like, that will never change? There's no point in even praying. Or is there something in your past, maybe something in your life right now, that you look at and think, there is no way God could do any kind of good here? Ephesians 3:20 says, God does immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine, which means God's work, God's presence, God's action in our life isn't only limited to the things that we can see. There are 1,000 different ways he is constantly at work in places we don't expect, without us even knowing. So are we open to the possibility that he might in fact surprise us, or do we close ourselves off and just assume he doesn't care? But even as I say this, as we think about these stories, I know what many of us are thinking. Like, it's easy to try and make this kind of point when we're looking at a story where this father's prayers are answered. His daughter is healed. Jesus brings her back to life. But what about the places where Jesus says no? What about the places it seems like he's not answering at all? Not long ago, I heard the story of two sisters, a woman named Jenna and Helen, who had struggled side by side for years with infertility. They'd both longed to have children. This is something they both prayed for, and for very different reasons. It just wasn't happening for either of them. For Jenna, the infertility couldn't really be explained. There wasn't one obvious reason why she couldn't get pregnant. But for Helen, in her 20s, she'd been diagnosed with cancer. And the treatment made it next to impossible for her to get pregnant and carry a child to full term. Well, to both of their surprise, they both became pregnant. Jenna through IVF, and Helen in a way that felt pretty miraculous. But shortly after Helen's baby was born, the doctor realized that her cancer had come back. A tumor had been growing pretty much right behind the baby the whole time, and while life was growing inside of her womb, there was also death, like bubbling up in her body. By the time they discovered it, there wasn't anything that they could do. And Jenna, Helen's sister, talks about the experience of her grief, the grief of both losing her sister and have this joy that they shared, even just for a brief moment, be snatched away. Go like that whiplash of feeling like our prayers have been answered, and then have all of that go away. It just crumbles right before them. And Jenna says there were only two things that kept her coming back to Jesus, and the first was this. She says, if I were going to deny him, I couldn't just deny his absence in this moment. I'd have to deny his presence in so many profoundly good moments too. She said, I didn't have the option to simply pick and choose. He's either with me even now, or he hasn't been here at all. And so because of that, I'll stay. I'll continue to try and trust him. But she said that the second thing in the season that kept her coming back to Jesus was the reality of her anger. She was too angry to walk away. She said it was a little bit like a raging argument with a spouse where you're too angry to step away, to go outside and get some air. The only way to express and actually deal with what I'm going through is to keep telling Jesus how angry I am with him. And as much as I'd like to wrap this up in some neat and tidy bow, I can't, because that's not how the story goes. But she says, even in my anger, I knew that Jesus still was with me. He hadn't answered my prayers in the way that I hoped, in the way that I wanted him to, but I'd be lying if I said that he had left me all alone. Jesus doesn't promise to meet us in the way we think is best. He often doesn't come in the way that we would choose. Jesus doesn't promise to give us all the things we hope and pray for, but he does give us himself. His presence, his grace. And that's exactly what we see in both of these interactions. As we look at these stories, this woman and this man, we see Jesus has time. He's not bothered by our need. In fact, he's willing to enter in, to actually get his hands dirty. And the whole point of Christmas, the whole message of the gospel is that Jesus is the one who actually comes to us first. Long before any of us decided to pursue him, he pursued us in order to bring us back to God. The wholeness that we long for, the healing that we need. That's exactly why Jesus came into the world in the first place. To take away our sin. To be with us in our pain. To give us new life. To give us himself. And so as easy as it is to ask Jesus, do you have time for me? I think we also need to ask, do I have time for Jesus? Do I have time for Jesus himself, and not just the things I want him to give me? And so now, as we prepare to come to this table, this tangible sign of what Jesus has promised to do for us, I think it's an invitation to do exactly what Jairus does, to do exactly what this woman does, and fall at Jesus' feet. This is a space for us to say, Jesus, there are so many places I need you to show up. But more than anything else, I know that I need you. And so, will you meet me? Will you help me? Would you bring me to yourself? Would the promise at the heart of Advent and Christmas actually be true? That you be God, come to dwell with your people. Would you come and dwell with us, with me, with you here today? So before we come to the table, I want to take a moment and pray and ask that this would be a space where Jesus genuinely comes near to us. So would you pray with me? Jesus, the Apostle Paul says so much of our life, it's like we are looking through a glass darkly towards you and what you're doing in the world. Our vision so often is cloudy and muddled. Our fears, our sin so often gets in the way. And yet you are a God who meets us with tenderness and compassion, who promises always to come when we ask for your help. And so we do pray that you would be near to us this morning, that you would minister to each of our hearts in exactly the places we need to know your grace. As we come to this table, would you open our eyes? Would you show us your beauty, that we would see you more clearly? Would you soften our hearts? Would you grow in us real hope as we look and remember all that you have done for us? We love you, Jesus, and we ask these things in your name. Amen.